Welcome to the Behaviour Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Okay, everybody, welcome to the Behaviour Speaks podcast. Today, I'm pretty excited to have Landa Fox here on the podcast with me. Hey, Landa.
Hi, Ben.
For those who don't know Landa, and I can't figure out if there's anybody out there that doesn't, but I'll read her bio. Landa Fox is a BCBA and a certified sexual health educator living in the Lekwungen territory, which is Victoria, BC. Her work focuses on sexual health and relationship education for those with unique learning needs. She works with schools, families, and individuals to create and modify existing sexual health and relationship education to be meaningful to those it is being presented to. She also works to create behavior support plans to address inappropriate sexual or sexualized behaviors. She trains teachers, staff, and communities about sexual health development, focusing on making sexual health education inclusive and accessible to all. Her areas of special interest within the area of sexual health education include how to promote a culture of consent and body autonomy within autism intervention, appropriate access to sex toys for people with disabilities, and generally educating people about everyone's right to knowledge and pleasure. That's super awesome. So again, super cool to have you here. You know, I think this conversation can go, 1,000 different ways. And I think any of them will be fun. I happened upon there's a sexual behavior research and practice special interest group that some folks may be familiar with. Those that aren't, it's an amazing resource. It's sort of a ABAI kind of special interest group, I guess. And they've got a Facebook group with, a ton of folks in it. And it's really the place to go when you have questions. And there's only 8 people listed on the page as actually having kind of expertise in the area. So it's amazing that an area so important and so, basic needs kind of related has so few experts. And so we're very lucky to have a Canadian, and not just a Canadian, but a local BC person as one on that list. And so I was super excited when Landa agreed to come on the podcast, and hopefully we can share some good stuff. So Landa, maybe we could just start by talking about kind of, your story about how you got into the field and how that led to, specializing in sexual behavior.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invite. Always happy to talk about sexuality with anybody, particularly when it comes to the merging of the two fields. So,
right on.
Yeah, excited to be here. My background, if you ask anybody who knew me in sort of middle school, high school, they probably would tell you that they thought I was going to be a sex therapist of some kind. The only model that I had for that, and the Canadian listeners will know, and maybe some international listeners as well, is Sue Johansson in the Sunday Night Sex Show.
Of course.
I know, right? And I just didn't know how to become her. And I was sort of like, well, she's her, and she's got that market cornered. And so I sort of like fell away from that path a little bit and stumbled like fully on accident into the field of autism intervention, early autism intervention. When I was doing my undergrad, I was in a co-op stream, and I needed a co-op work placement. And my co-op advisor was like, you should try this job working with autistic kids. And I was like, I don't know if that interests me. Like, what is that even about? And, but I applied and I got it. And I just loved the children, and B, the science and the merging of like, wait, you can play with children for a living and have it still be science. And I was thrilled. And then, so I did that work for, I always say sort of like 10 years, but then, the older that you get and you reflect back, like time, just how does time work? And so probably between 10 and 15 years, I worked in autism intervention, and, worked with a lot of younger kids just because, resources go where the money flows. But I always liked working with older youth and teens and young adults as well. And I started to see over the years that there was this gap in this area that I had loved and wanted to learn about when I was younger, around sexuality and the people that I was working with now. And we weren't talking about these things. And I sort of just had like a career life shakeup. And I was like, okay, should I just leave the field of ABA and just jump into a career in sexual health education? And then I was like, wait a minute, why don't you just put those two things together? And at that time, I didn't really have a good template either for what that would look like, or is there anybody else in the field that's doing this work? I attended ABAI, I can't even remember where it was, and found the Sexual Behavior Research and Practice Special Interest Group years ago when August Stockwell was the president, and I had sort of like vaguely connected with the group then. And yeah, just sort of was like, that's it. I'm going to just put these passions together. And so I started pursuing my sexual health educator certification. And in Canada, that is offered through one agency, which is Options for Sexual Health in Vancouver. So I did a 6-month course with them, and you do an exam and a practicum and all of that, and became a sexual health educator. So now I've just shifted my practice to focus on the merging of those two areas. And then as you sort of start to specialize, you sort of realize that the more that you know about something, the more you know that you don't know. So then even within the area of sexual health, there's so many areas that you can sort of sub-specialize in. And so even as you mentioned, the special interest group of ABAI on our Facebook page and our website, we have that referral list that you mentioned previously. And even within that, we've got, I think there's 10 or 12 different subcategories that there's different people that specialize in different things. Everything from, gender diversity to kink and BDSM to reproduction to how to discuss with families. And there's different people that specialize in those different areas. So there's still lots for me to learn. There's still lots for the field to learn, but I'm just excited to be kind of embedded within this area.
Oh, awesome. 100%. I just opened up that referral form or referral list today myself, and there's actually 18 subspecialties in this list. It's mind-blowing. Like, I mean, when I think of sort of sexual health, obviously there's sort of the standard, and I don't even know if that's even the right term, but there's school sex education, that seems to be a realm. And then there's maybe a little bit on dating and that sort of thing, kind of relationship skills. I've been hearing more about consent, which I think is really important, of course. And then masturbation seems to be the other thing. I have a kid who's masturbating in the living room. What do I do? Or on the school bus. What do I do? But there's all these other areas and it shows kind of who specializes in them. And I'm just going to read some of the ones that your name is listed under that, folks might not even think that there's even, things you can address. So just good old pleasure skills. As we talk about leisure skills all the time, but pleasure skills, I mean, that's awesome. Religious, spiritual, and cultural factors, racial factors, sex toys, lube, and sex tools, which I know you specialize in, and we're going to talk on some more. Legal issues and sexual harm, substance use, and sex. Like, these are just things that it certainly makes sense that they could all be connected. And I think an important piece is, I know in your bio, you talked about kind of focusing on those kinds of issues in autism spectrum disorders, but I would guess that you and everyone in this research practice group works well beyond folks with autism, right?
Yeah. And I think that's a good place to start the conversation. And I know lots of folks that are kind of in these two realms. We have talking a lot about lately the kind of the difference between a scope of practice and a scope of competence. And that, if you kind of picture your traditional Venn diagram meme, you've got these two circles that are coming together in the middle. And so obviously as behavior analysts, we know that like addressing behavior is something that we can do, right? That's in our scope. And sexual behavior is, it's a behavior. It's something that people are engaging in. So is it within the scope of practice of behavior analysts? For sure. But is it in the scope of competence of every behavior analyst? No, right? So everybody that's doing work in both of these areas that is, sort of either listed on that referral list, or hopefully other people are doing their own education. And the people on that list may not be exhaustive, but we've tried to sort of search for folks that have pursued certification or have extensive experience in both areas, that the scope of competence really requires that you do continuing education in the field of human sexuality. So we're doing continuing education as behavior analysts, but we're also, I'm doing continuing education in the realm of just human sexuality. So taking webinars, and well, everything's a webinar right now, but taking webinars about just general sexual health education, how to, fuse sexual health education within a social justice framework, using sex education as a vehicle to sort of move social justice issues forward. They really are linked. How can we address, issues of systemic racism and the history of racism and sexuality together? And those are all things that, we have to bring all of those together in terms of knowing about sexuality. Because if we're just treating sexuality or sexual health behaviors as behaviors, but without knowing the details around human sexuality, there is an increased risk of harm, be that like physical harm, just like harm to the client, putting the client in a dangerous situation, putting people that are supporting the client into dangerous or unsafe situations. So you really have to have training in both of those areas to be able to be competent. And there's a few of us, and we want to make ourselves available as much as possible to have people be able to access good quality information and good quality resources. I mean, the internet is wonderful, but it is, getting sexual health information online, if you don't know what you're looking for, or you don't know what's accurate, can be really tough. So even the best intentioned behavior analyst, just like looking through like online, or we're looking through even research, even some of the research within the field of applied behavior analysis and things related to sexuality, is misclassifying things like fetishes. We've seen recently with the move to advocate for a full retraction of harmful research around gender nonconforming behaviors in the Reckers and Lovass study that's just recently had that sort of like editorial note released. So even contacting the literature doesn't really give you the critical thinking skills around some of these issues that further training in the area of human sexuality would do. So really just, my sort of big message is just really think critically about what you're good at and what you know about. Obviously, human sexuality is an experience that we all have. And so I think people might equate their own personal experiences with some sort of level of expertise. Whereas like if you wouldn't have that, if you thought like I'm a behavior analyst, okay, and is addressing severe self-injurious behavior within the scope of behavior analysis, yes. Do I have competence in that? No. So I wouldn't address those. I wouldn't accept that person as a client. I wouldn't accept a client with like severe food refusal behavior. That's not within my scope of competence, even though it is something that behavior analysts do.
That's awesome. And I think, and you bring up a good point that now actually becoming, and I'm very happy, a theme in the podcasts even that I've been doing. I interviewed Alexia Stack, and we talked a lot about trauma and how she's contacting research in a bunch of different areas, social work and the like. I talked to Hillary McClinton about kind of supervision and mentorship, and a little bit on kind of sleep and whatnot, and how they have to contact kind of research in different areas, which I think is super important. I think that's something that some of the old school folks might say they've always been doing this, but it seems like for the longest time, we only looked at Java.
Yeah.
And that's where we kind of got all our information. Eventually we got it, and sure, we got a few other like journals, behavioral disorders and a few other ones like that, but they're all, kind of same thing, different pile,
Yeah.
And sort of the idea that, behavior is within our scope. And so we can address kind of anything we want. And other research from other areas, just isn't all that important, has sort of been the vibe. But that seems to have changed a lot in the last couple of years, which I think is amazing, around sort of contacting research in other areas. And so where do you kind of go to get your information that's sort of outside of ABA?
Yeah. I think that's so important. I remember early in my career getting that message of like, we're behavior analysts and everything's behavior. We can do anything. It's just like, oh, that's just not, a helpful mindset. Yeah. I mean, what? So the Society for the Scientific Study of Sexuality has a conference coming up next week. So that's like a resource. There's just even like sexual health, like resource websites One of my favorite ones to go to is a website called Scarletine. It's just good quality sexual health education information that's available online in like an accessible format to sort of like tweens, teens, youth. But like I go there all the time just like for general information. And I think the idea of like you said, journals and contacting like, okay, yeah, we get JABA. I mean, we've got the issue of like paywalls and all of this sort of preventing us from accessing, research in different fields if we don't have access via, being associated with an academic institution, or, we all as behavior analysts have access to JABA through the BACB portal. But there are other journals that are important to sort of, reach out and contact. And I think it is important to sort of, yes, journals and subscriptions can be expensive, but it's part of the continuing education mandate that we have, I think, as behavior analysts. So, can you get a subscription to everything? No. Should we try to get a subscription to a few things? Probably. I mean, there's lots of privilege in that statement that I recognize as well.
100%.
But I think there's a bigger issue in terms of the access to information. And it's sort of like, I published this research in this academic journal, and I don't understand why people aren't doing this thing that I, have discovered, is important. It's like, well, because nobody can read it. They can only read the accessible, like news blip that's put, online for free that doesn't describe the methods that now we can't do it with replicable precision. Like there's all kinds of issues, but like a few of the journals that I contact, the Sex and Disability is one that I have a subscription to that I read frequently. They have a mix of disabilities, that they have research published on. So that could be something from like physical disability or like a spinal cord injury, CP. But there's journal articles in there quite often that focus on intellectual or developmental disabilities. The American Journal of Sexuality Education is another one. So that focuses more on like actual educational issues and challenges. There's the Canadian Journal of Human Sexuality, the Journal of Sex Research. And one thing that I do for that is just even subscribing to like journal alerts. So in my email, I get like, weekly, daily, sometimes too frequently. It interrupts my day. And it just at least gives you like the abstract, access to the abstract, and you can see how you can try to access that journal. And I have had like a near 100% success rate of emailing authors of articles and saying like, hey, I, teach this area, sex education, working with, autistic individuals. And would it be possible to get a copy of your article? And, 100% of the time when I've reached out, the people have been really responsive with that. So you just have to be willing to sort of like put in that little bit of extra effort, which I think is, in the age of really fast emails and is pretty easy to do. So yeah, there's a really great conference coming up called SLAM, Sexuality Leaders and Movers. And it's a sexuality not related to ABA or disability, but it's put on, and all of the speakers are all people of color. So really looking at sort of those intersections again of like social justice and sexuality. So there's lots of stuff out there. I think like we'll just send a bunch of people to the ABAI special interest group. If people are on Facebook, that is we're constantly putting things up there when we see conferences and stuff come up. There's webinars pretty frequently. So like I did one on Wednesday. I know the president has one coming up. And so that just, frequently different things are popping up different places. And so it does take some work to sort of find them, but we're doing our best to sort of put those in one central location on the sexual behavior special interest group Facebook
That's
page.
amazing.
Yeah.
I realized I missed a page, subspecialty. So there's actually up to like 25 now. I found the page with the kink, BDSM, polyamory. All I think of that is bountiful BC.
But so much more. Yeah, different relationship structures, definitely. Yeah. So we've got some folks that specialize in that for sure.
So cool. One thing promoting that kind of culture of consent but body autonomy in autism intervention. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for me, and this is something that, I've been, intersected with a few other folks in the area, and we've all been sort of thinking the same things. And so just as I started to move more into thinking about sexual health, and obviously the topic of consent is huge, just like in our culture and society. right now, and rightfully so, that we're just starting to think a bit more critically about some of the things that we're doing, or we might have historically been doing in autism intervention. And for me, it was sort of like, oh, I'm learning all these things about like body autonomy and consent and how to teach consent to even like young kids. And then I was looking at like, well, what have I done in the past, or what are some practices that I'm putting in place, maybe even currently, that just like are making me feel a bit like, ugh, like icky about, some of the things that I'm doing. And so really it's just about sort of like, we need to teach people how to say no. So we're getting into these situations just culturally or in society where we're seeing that people aren't just thinking about sexuality and the long-term impacts of like some of the things that we might be teaching folks even when they're younger. So things like, the kind of classic, just like pop culture examples. We're coming up on the season now, is the like, oh, isn't it funny? My kid's sitting on Santa's lap in the picture and they're screaming. And it's like, is it funny? Like, you're forcing a child to do something that they're clearly sending you a message that they don't want to be doing. And so what would be a better way to do that? And so if we think of like behavior analysts, like, could we like do some shaping of like Santa Claus lap sitting behavior, or like, why is that even a life goal? Who's like, like, is sitting on Santa's lap for a picture one time a year like a thing that we need to be moving towards? Who is this really for? We can just stand by Santa. So
absolutely.
For me, it's sort of like the idea of like, how can we teach people that they're the boss of their own body? And that can start young, so that when that person is older, they can learn how to say no. The big sort of trigger for me with that was just some of the statistics, which there's, various sources that, quote different percentages and things like that. But folks with disabilities, whether that be somebody who's autistic, somebody with an intellectual developmental disability of some other type, or a physical disability, are at a greater likelihood, up to 7 times more likely to be sexually abused than somebody who we might say would be like typically developing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was sort of like, well, like, why is that happening? And there's, a ton of reasons that we can get into, but I think one of those is like, those people have people touching their bodies and moving their bodies and doing things to their bodies, and have had basically anytime that they've said no has been extinguished. Yep. Really, from a behavioral perspective. So if we extinguish somebody's ability to say no across the entirety of their childhood, and then all of a sudden when they're an adult, we're expecting them to be able to say no when somebody tries to touch them in a way
mm-hmm.
that they don't like. And that could be something from like a hug, like all the way to like actual like genital touching.
Mm-hmm.
And so what could we be doing in practices? And obviously, like, my background is a lot in early autism intervention, and I still do some work mostly via supervision of like aspiring behavior analysts at this point. What can we do in early intervention programs that would foster that skill and that ability, and having kids be like in control of their bodies? And so one of the things is basically, and like I do this as like a standard practice now, and I encourage all my supervisees to do it, is if you've got a bunch of programs that you're running, one of the programs should be the child's no gets reinforced. So, maybe I have a line and I've got like, we're going to do, this many tacts, we're going to do this many listener receptive, and you're going to do in the session this many you respect the child's no. And the interventionist just like checks it off, like, yes, they're doing it. So that sometimes when their no is respected, or is when they say a no, it's respected. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't have to be every single time. People are sort of like, well, we have to change their diaper. It's like, well, yeah, that's a health and safety issue too. It's not every time. We all have to get used to our no not being respected. But for the most part, most of us have our no respected way more often than some of the little people, or even not so little people that we're supporting.
If you're collecting continuing education credits for this podcast episode, you'll need to know the 3 secret words. The first secret word is penis. Mm-hmm. And even with the diaper example, you have to change it now. We could change it in 3 minutes. You don't have to change it immediately. And as soon as they say no, okay, let's take a break and come back to it.
For sure. Yeah. Right. Embedding some choices in there for sure. Definitely. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one thing that I've sort of put in, or even just like, when we think about from ABA and early autism intervention in particular, those sort of like prompting hierarchies. So,
Mm-hmm.
what does our prompting hierarchy look like? Are we using full physical prompting as our first level of prompt, just like regardless of whether that's necessary for the learner? Are we really doing like a good analysis of what level of prompting is needed? Why do we have to put in physical prompting? Could we use shaping for this skill instead that doesn't require physical prompting? And sort of, I think just thinking more critically about like, what is the thing that we're teaching? Why are we using physical prompting? How necessary is this? And that's not to say that that might not be needed all of the time, but you can also just think of, what does assent withdrawal look like on the part of the client? So if you're doing a, classic example of like, doing an inset puzzle to sort of like try to teach that sort of leisure skill or like pre-academic skill to like a really little person, then, if you're doing hand over hand to help them put the pieces in, are they giving you signs with their body that they're fine with that, right? But if they start to resist, that's them withdrawing their assent from you touching them. And so we can respect that for the learner. Do we have to be doing that puzzle right now? No. Is there something else that we could be doing? Probably. And so really paying attention to some of those ways that we interact with students, because if we're touching them and then I see often it's like, but then when they touch us, then somehow that's like not okay. We're telling them
Right.
no hands down. But like how many times a day, if we were to take some data, and I haven't done this, but I probably should, is like, how often are you touching them? And we're saying like, that's okay. And then how often are they touching you? And we're saying, that's not okay.
Right. Yeah. Fair
And
enough.
just, yeah. And so a lot of it is just really for me is just encouraging people to not entirely change their practice, starting tomorrow, but just to develop those critical thinking skills and then change your practice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of this makes me think about sort of my experiences before I kind of got into ABA, where I was working as a group home manager and working kind of residential care in different settings with adults with kind of autism, but also a lot of severe intellectual disabilities. And the behaviors I were seeing are exactly kind of what you're talking about as far as, not being taught any of this stuff as young folks. So, I worked with one fella and it was actually quite hilarious. Clearly he had been, subjected to some sort of early intervention because he would come up to me on a regular basis and he would grab my wrists and make me clap my hands.
Right. Yeah.
And laugh his head off at me. Like, and he's like 25, and
Right.
actually clearly he's had that done to him over and over and over and over again.
Yeah. And
But
this
then,
is, and that this is how, in his mind, like this is how people interact. Right?
exactly, yeah, because
This is a thing that we do back and forth.
yeah,
I make you do a thing, you make me do a thing.
yeah, 100%. And then another fella who, and this is sort of more where things get dangerous, is of course, all these guys are, adults and willing to, on a dime, take off their clothes at staff demand.
Yeah.
Okay, clothes off, and immediately they're naked.
Yeah.
And nobody sort of looked at that as being, even I didn't really look at that as being strange at the time.
A problem. Yeah.
But realizing now that, that could happen anywhere.
Yeah.
Or and they go out into public or they go to the mall and other behaviors like using urinals and dropping their pants to their ankles and alone. There's just so many sort of examples I can think of adults who weren't taught any of those things.
Yeah.
That wasn't a standard part of early intervention, but they were taught clap hands.
Yeah. Right. And I mean, I think maybe just in general, we need to spend more time thinking about what we're doing at one point, at point A, and what is that going to mean for that person when they get to point L, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're just kind of like teaching things according to like a manual or, steps that we learned when we were being trained or whatever. And,
Mm-hmm.
and we're not thinking critically about what that means. I mean, a few things kind of come to mind with the examples that you gave me. One is that we know that staff turnover, in this field is high. And so the people have a variety of different, caregivers or people that are sort of, responsible for assisting them in some way coming in and out. And so they do have, if they're just told to take their clothes off by a revolving door of people. And they just learn that like, if someone tells you that you have to take your clothes off, then you do it, then the revolving door of people could be anybody, right? That could be somebody that is intending to cause them harm, as opposed to somebody who that might not be their intention, but the unforeseen or not thought of consequences that it's
100%.
harmful. And the other one with like the hands clapping and like those sorts of things, like those body boundaries. And like I talk about this often when I'm in the front of like any presentation that I'm doing to a group, is this idea of the spectrum of sexuality. And on one end, we have, people being seen as asexual, and on the other end, hypersexual. And people with disabilities are usually slotted into one of those columns by society at large. And there's this whole part of that spectrum in the middle. And, the spectrum could be like a 3D ball kind of thing, if we really think about it. But there's this whole area in the middle that most people are going to fall in, right? If you think of your traditional, curve for any behavior, there's going to be people at either end, yes, but the majority of people are going to fall in the middle. But if we see those people as like asexual, and we see the people that we're supporting as asexual, then we think like, oh, they're childlike. They don't need this information. They need to be protected. And I see this manifesting in like, people hugging caretakers, like staff members, interventionists, therapists, whoever, like up until they're, an age when that wouldn't be expected of a typical child, or, we're using like that sort of physical contact, and we're not teaching them boundaries. And so they're, hugging an education assistant or hugging a therapist or sitting on a therapist's lap, for an extended period of time to like, oh, we need them to sit on their lap so that they stay at the circle time or whatever. It's like, well, that's all well and cute until that person is 12 and gets an erection. And now all of a sudden it's a problem. But you didn't do anything between ages 0 and 12 to teach them about body boundaries. And, if we're infantilizing people, we're at risk of putting them into potentially dangerous situations, both for themselves to be harmed, or for them to be labeled as a harmful person, right?
Totally. Yeah, that's, I think of a few examples where, we suddenly see a new behavior emerge because, so like a common one I've been seeing a lot lately is a teenager or a young adult and a female staff, and there's lots of that. Like you said, they hug, they hang out, they're close, and then one day the guy's hand, the client's hand gets a little too close, moves up the leg a little too far,
right,
and immediately the whole dynamic of the house changes, and now we've got, like you said, hypersexualized behavior. What's happening? He's going to become a rapist. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? And we can't let him around females anymore. We can't let him out in the community anymore because he did that thing. And we make all these sorts of assumptions that the goal there was that it even wasn't, because we never taught that kid anything.
Yeah. And I see that definitely, like people, that spectrum that I was talking about from asexual to hypersexual, people will be in that asexual column, and then all of a sudden something happens and people make this giant leap across the middle to hypersexual and forgot about everything in the center. I mean, there's a few things there that like, I see that as somebody who, does work in the area of assessment and treatment planning for inappropriate sexual behaviors, is that like often I will get consultations or referrals. And when you start to ask the right kinds of questions, you realize that the behavior isn't sexual at all. It has maybe a sexual topography, but not necessarily a sexual function. And so you really need to be skilled at both functional assessment and understanding of sexual behaviors and the typical development of sexual behaviors. So, I mean, kind of circling back to our conversation about looking outside of, the area, I think this is another area where behavior analyst training is lacking, where we don't necessarily have, unless we've decided, on our own as trainees to look at human development courses. And so are we taking development courses in language? No. Are we taking development courses in, fine and gross motor skills? No. So what do we do in those cases if we don't know? We ask an SLP or an OT. And do we take courses in the development of human sexuality? No, like probably most of us not, right? And so what should we do in that case? We should reach out to somebody that has expertise in the development of human sexuality. And so some people will sort of say like, well, is it really that important to go through, half hour of this workshop was based on this backgrounder of human sexuality development. But if you don't know what's typical for somebody at a certain age,
Mm-hmm.
then you don't know what, might be concerning.
Yeah.
That's important to know and understand as well. And a lot of that stuff is just curiosity. And this is where I see again that referral is often, unfortunately, reactive. Something's happened, someone calls me. And then when I look at like, what do I need to do in terms of, our kind of traditional columns of prevention, teaching, and responding? Well, the teaching is like, they don't know about private body parts. They don't know that somebody's butt isn't something that you should touch.
Mm-hmm.
They have never been told about breasts, or, breasts haven't been labeled for them. They don't know that that's a body part that shouldn't be touched. If we don't discriminate between the differences between a breast and a hand,
sure.
What
Exactly.
do you touch and what do you not touch?
Yeah.
We pick up those things, maybe naturally in our environment, but some of the people that we're supporting, might not. And we're good at saying that about some other behaviors, they need to be taught the labels for whatever XYZ foods or, leisure items that they might be interested in, or clothing, but they're not taught the body parts.
Yeah.
So that's another sort of body autonomy consent sort of thing, or just early intervention teaching, is like advocating for body parts to be taught.
It makes me think about kind of, so sexuality in and of itself has been a pretty taboo topic. I mean, there's lots of there's things in that list, that I think that, a lot of people wouldn't talk about with anybody, even maybe their own partners. And so kind of a two parts here. I don't even know how this goes. So you've got this sort of one part where you've got these folks with developmental disabilities, or just, or just folks with a lack of education. Don't even have to have a developmental disability, but don't know that, like you said, the vagina and the elbow are not the same thing, and touching an elbow and touching a vagina have completely different, effects on people. Mm-hmm. And so they don't know that all that. And then there's a whole sort of world. There's a whole world of taboo and boundaries that we've kind of been taught by society, that these folks have never learned. But then there's also the issue of all that taboo. I don't know if taboo is the right word, but where parents will happily say, I need an SLP or an OT. Mm. But I don't know that every parent will jump to, I need a sexual health educator.
Right.
Right. Yeah. And so how do you get around that barrier? Because I mean, I think that's a big issue. Well, it should be my job to talk to my kids, but then there's also my kid's asexual or hypersexual sort of thing.
Yeah. I have thoughts about that for sure. I mean, I agree with you in terms of taboo and not discussed. And I do like an activity often, especially if I'm leading a workshop, and, if I can't say penis or vulva or nipples or anus with, some level of confidence, and just, those are just other body parts. Those are just scientific words.
Sure.
And so I get people to like label a picture, like a diagram of a vulva, and like, this is the urethra, this is the vagina, this is the clitoris. If you can't say those things, you can't teach them to other people in a way that, breeds confidence.
Fair enough.
An example that I usually say is, the classic like Head and Shoulders, Knees and Toes song that like labels all of the key body parts, but it totally skips over the entire torso. Like, we just won't mention.
It totally does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Right. So I mean, I've like rewritten it a few times to involve like a verse that is like nipples and buttocks.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so it's just, we definitely need to get more comfortable as a culture. I see subtle shifts happening in that direction for sure. But yeah, if you can't talk about it, then you can't teach somebody else. And even like, something for some of the folks that listeners might be supporting is, users of AAC devices, penis, buttocks, vulva, vagina, breasts. Those aren't like, if you select to open the like body parts tab, those usually aren't like pre-populated on there. You have to like go through a few different boxes in like the back end to like open up the accessibility of those. But like, those are body parts that people should know about. So so advocating for that. I mean, people, teachers or parents will suddenly say like, yeah, but then they'll just be pressing a penis button again and again and again. And like, and it's like, show me a 2-year-old that hasn't yelled about butt or penis when they learn those words,
Sure.
like, and I'll give you a significant sum of money. Like when kids learn new words that have some sort of reaction from other folks in their environment, they're going to start saying them often. And so we can manage that and figure out how to respond to that, but it doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to say them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It makes me think of a case that I had once where the kid was, had a lot of echolalia, and he learned the word penis, and he would just go up to people and go, penis, and just wait for the reaction. And he just loved it, just lived off of it.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think, from a behavior analyst perspective, we can see the function of that behavior pretty clearly, right?
Sure.
And that's because, in society, we don't use those words very often, but if we did, then it wouldn't be a big deal. And then we wouldn't, so there's lots of just like general societal work to do at that level. But and so that sort of circles back to like getting, parents or honestly, like teacher, like anybody, right? Like not just parents, anybody that's working to support any human, to be able to talk about some of these things. And I agree that like there's so many things that lots of the people that we're working with need, some extra support with.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only so much time. And unfortunately, tied to that is so much, funding or accessibility. And so sexual health education can kind of be sort of like, the last thing on people's lists. It is something that if we look just like at data from Canada, like the majority of parents want their kids to learn sex education in schools, whether that's because they don't want to talk about it themselves at home, or they think that like, school may be able to offer like better information. We've got a long way to go in terms of sex education in schools. Obviously in Canada, we're further along than some other like international places when it comes to sex ed, but we're also behind some other places in terms of sex education. So when parents are talking about, I'll use parents kind of as the example because usually, they are part of who the client is for me. It's the child and then their family who may be the decision maker for them. In British Columbia, I use the Ministry of Education, like learning standards that are very clearly talk about sexual health education from kindergarten, through to the end of high school. There's very clear goals around what should be learned at different ages. And so it's kind of like, well, it's not me saying that your child should learn this. It's Ministry of Education saying that your child should learn this. I mean, I'm saying it too, but it's helpful to have like a government document to be like, look, I'm not just making up that your child should know their body parts. That's something that they're going to be learning in kindergarten. And, all the way up until, later grades and learning about puberty, it starts in like 4th, 5th, 6th grade, puberty lessons. 7th, 8th grade is more around contraception and STIs, starting to look at like gender identity in those like later sort of like middle to high school, entering high school age ranges, looking at consent, healthy relationship decision-making. Those are all really clearly outlined in the BC physical health education curriculum. So that's a reference that people can use to sort of advocate, because parents will advocate like, I want my child to be learning what their other peers are learning. They're learning how to write sentences. I want my kid to learn how to write sentences. Totally fair. Your kids' peers are also learning, to how babies are made. So that's something that your child should be learning, in the 2nd grade as well. Different kinds of family structures, all of that. And we can put in stuff around like figuring out like, how do queer families have children? Not everybody, has some sort of like sexual intercourse to have a baby. So that's information that kids are going to be learning in those early grades. And so your child has a right to access that information as well. So that's one way in. I think another route in is just, I often have parents ask me like, I want him to be able to tell me, I want her to be able to tell me if she's feeling sad, if she's feeling happy, if she's feeling sick. And it's like, well, wouldn't you like your child to be able to tell you if their vulva was painful? If they had a urinary tract infection, wouldn't it be good to be able to say like, my vulva hurts? And as well as like my stomach hurts and my head hurts and my ear hurts.
Yeah.
So we can teach kids, to label how their body is feeling. And we should include genitals. Kids in early grades especially kids in like preschool, kindergarten, and kids that are at higher risk of putting things in their mouth, like can get things like pinworm, and that can cause like anal itching. And so if your kid can't say like my bum or like anus hurts or is itchy, then they can't tell you that they might have pinworm that might need to be treated by a doctor. And something like that can turn into then like a referral to me because their child is rectal digging or digging feces or pulling feces out. And then that leads to like eating feces or smearing feces. And at the end of the day, it's just that your kid had pinworm and their anus was itchy and they couldn't tell you. So health, and like medical is another way in. And then the third way in, which I like to use those other two first, because I don't want to use a scare tactic for people, but it is that like your child is at increased risk because of a disability or a language barrier of being abused by somebody else. We know this from data and statistics. And so if something happens and your child is harmed by somebody, they can't tell you if they don't know to start the names of their body parts. If they don't know that sex includes touching somebody else's genitals or mouths and genitals coming together. If sex is just penis and vagina and something else that doesn't fit penis and vagina happens to a child, they don't know that they've been sexually assaulted, or an adult for that matter, if they don't have that information. So by this narrow definition of sex, we're increasing the risk of harm to people because they can't identify something that's happened to them is sex.
Cool. So it sounds like British Columbia is somewhat progressive, maybe relative to the rest of the country, because you talk about the learning standards, which are those are quite a lot more detail and around different areas than I would have thought, like things like gender diversity and whatnot being included. And then you also had mentioned that your credential is only offered in BC?
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of people that take that options for sexual health educator certification from across the country. So the cohort that I was in had people, there was 6 or 7 of us, and 4 of us were from sort of like BC, Vancouver Island, Lower Mainland, but there was a person from Ontario that came. And there was also a person from California that came actually, because they'd heard good things about the program. Yeah. So it's one route. It's certainly available to lots of folks. I haven't looked to see what they're doing in terms of their offerings for, during the pandemic, if they've sort of changed, how they're offering that, but it is because it was an in-person course, meant traveling for myself from Victoria to Vancouver, on weekends to participate in the teaching. But yeah, so it's, and that's sort of like one route. The ASECT certification in the States, so the American Association of Sexuality Educators and Counselors and Therapists, certifies people internationally as well.
Oh, okay.
The term American is in there. Some American people like to think like, well, American means, North American. And I was like, I don't think that many Canadians would agree that American means North American, but it is available for international certification. So there's different places where people can get additional, continuing education. But yeah, like I think BC is fairly progressive in terms of our sexuality education. I think it's still being implemented, to varying degrees and standards across, obviously different geographic regions. So, here in Victoria, there's a team of educators at our local sexual health clinic, Island Sexual Health, and they are often hired by school districts to deliver sexual health curriculum. In the Lower Mainland, there's a number of different sexuality educators that offer the same sort of thing. So they will be contracted by a school to go in. Options has an education team. There's a few others for your Lower Mainland listening population.
The second secret word is vulva.
There's an organization called Shift, Jessie Woolen and Salima Noon Educators is another one. So there's a few others, and they teach sexual health education in schools. And that's, good for schools that they are recognizing that their physical health education teachers, sort of thinking about like classic like Mean Girls like scenario, or I think Big Mouth, when they have like their gym teachers teaching sexual health education. There's a stereotype of sort of like how that can go sideways. So a lot of schools do hire these outside professionals where this is their specialization. But what I found for the kids and the youth that I support is that information is presented in a way that might not be as accessible for them. It may be accessible for some, but not all. So what I find that I do is modify curriculum, modify how it's presented in order to make it accessible for the learners that I'm working with. And that could be one-on-one, that could be small group. And they might need the information represented like a number of times. And so I might do some of that work one-on-one myself to sort of determine what's the best way to teach. And then I might share that information with families, like here's some resources here so you can help to support that at home. So yeah, we have a fairly inclusive, scientifically accurate sex education delivered in this province, but the standards I think would vary for sure.
Right. So when it comes to sexual education, I think one area that a lot of us run into and a lot of us get asked questions about, and a lot of us start to make recommendations on that may not be well informed and may lead to problems, is related to masturbation.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the common things that I've run into in the past and certainly didn't know what to do with it was either there were, folks that were engaging in behaviors that were like masturbation, but it wasn't. So they didn't know how to masturbate. And so they're rubbing against things, or they're, doing things that potentially causing harm to their self, maybe almost looks like self-injury to their penis or whatever, but it's actually just them trying to do something with this erection that they have. To the other side of the coin, where people have somehow managed to teach themselves to masturbate, because, once you figure it out, it's a pretty reinforcing behavior, and you can do it over and over again. And so the questions tend to be either A, how do I teach this person to masturbate? Or B, how do I stop them?
Right. Yeah. There's so many layers. And this is I think a great example of this thing around like the scope of practice versus scope of competency. So there's already in my head, I've got 35 different questions that I want to ask people when this behavior comes up. Right. And so I'll jump into a few of them. Maybe we'll get them jumbled and they'll come out in the end. But yeah, so again, looking back at what have we taught people from the beginning? So A, do they even know that these body parts are private? Do they even know what public and private is? Do they even have access to privacy? So many people that I've consulted with or, had, just people asking me questions is sort of like, well, they're masturbating in the living room or they're masturbating in public. And it's like, well, where does this person have privacy? It's like, oh, they don't. We have to have 24-hour line of sight, all the time with this person. It's like, so when are they supposed to masturbate? They don't have a private place. So what can we do to figure out privacy for them? And obviously, depending, I feel like I was looking the other day, I'm going to get a bunch of mugs that say "it depends" and give them to all my supervisors. And I saw that I think it's the cover photo right now for the BCBAs using the ISCA Facebook group.
Right. Yeah.
But I was just, it speaks to me so much because it's just it depends. So, does the person have access to privacy? Yes or no? How can we facilitate privacy? How is privacy facilitated? It depends. Obviously, that can be very, very complicated for some people, depending on other behaviors that they might engage in, how safe they might be, et cetera. But we should at least try, and we should try really hard to figure out a way to make that work for a person, because privacy is just I think along with pleasure, a fundamental human right, the right to be alone. Some people have never been left alone. And that's just makes me sad, because I think that that's something that, a lot of people need to be able to recharge, is just time and space away from other people. If I didn't have that, I would not be, a good human half the time. Right. So I think we need to think critically about that again. So yeah, public names of body parts, public and private body parts. Does the person have access to privacy? I also think that, masturbation is a self-reinforcing behavior. It's a fundamental, primary reinforcer for most people. And some of the people that I might consult with, or that people listening might have supported in the past, might not have a lot of other leisure skills that they really enjoy or want to do or engage in, or somebody has decided that, they need to be cut off from a certain amount of TV time. And so now they don't have anything else that they want to do. And so their leisure options are watching TV, sleeping, or masturbating. I mean, if we look, that might be a lot of people's leisure time choices, regardless, right? You got your Netflix, you're sleeping, or you're masturbating, and like, why is that so different for the people that we support? So if they don't have something else to be doing, then why can't they masturbate? What's the problem? So thinking critically about that, obviously, again, there's issues around culture and religion and people's personal histories with that, and those get embedded and intertwined. And it's not the people that are working to support a person have a problem with it. So it's like, well, how can we help facilitate that? And people have a right to say, like, I'm not comfortable providing so-and-so with their lube to masturbate, but okay, well then we need to find somebody that works to support them that is, or a way that they can have access to lube that, nobody has to facilitate for them, but that's a right that they have. Which brings me sort of to like lube and sex toys. Maybe I'll insert one other thing before we go down that road, because I could talk about lube and sex toys for a while. But another thing with, particularly as people get older and they might be more likely to be on a medication, is that a lot of medications that people that we might support are like antipsychotics, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications. And depending on what the medication is, most of those will have some sort of sexual side effect. What that looks like for an individual person may vary, but even like, if I have depression and I go to the doctor and I get a prescription, not every doctor is saying, this may have an impact on your libido, or this may have an impact on your ability to have an orgasm. They're not saying that to me as a person who can go in there and has strong self-advocacy skills. So the chances that they're saying that to a parent and they're prescribing it to a nonverbal child or somebody who's an adult that doesn't have the ability to advocate or ask the questions, and they're interpreting people as asexual, is going to be even lower. So that's like super important, I think, for people to think about, and they don't, and can sometimes be the key thing, especially if you're like injuring yourself masturbating. It could be that person had been able to masturbate to orgasm successfully for years, and then there was a change in their medication, and now they have anorgasmia, so the inability to achieve orgasm, and it's a side effect of that medication. So they're looking for this reinforcer, and they're having an extinction burst.
Yeah, 100%.
And then they're harming themselves. So, and that's because their medication changed. And if you don't know that that's a side effect of medications because no one said it, and you don't have special training, then you don't know, right? So that's something that I see super often. And I've had, a couple people that I do a brief consult, and I mention that, and they say, oh my God, I'm going to have to mention this to my physician. And then they get in touch with me again saying, thank you, that, we made a medication change and things are better.
Are there some, common or well-known medications that that have those effects?
I mean, anything in the family of those like antidepressants for sure, antipsychotic medications, and some anti-anxiety medications as well.
Wow, which really is like anyone who's sort of institutionalized in our that we work with. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, totally. And so those are going to, like I said, like any side effect of medication, it's going to differ across the specific medication. Sure. But we've also got like lots of things that are, and this is again where I would say like medical consultation. It's not an area that I have like extensive expertise in, and I would seek somebody outside. But even like I see a lot of like off-label prescribing for folks that I support, right? Like it's a medication that's meant to help with seizures, but we're prescribing it for some other reason or whatever.
Yes.
And so like maybe we don't even know about what the side effects of that might be for this person with this profile. And, and asking those kinds of questions to the prescribing medical provider, I think is important. Yeah.
Super fascinating. And I guess, and I know we wanted to kind of segue into lube and toys. Maybe this might be the way. Is I've also heard of some medications, because I mean for both, whether it's a vagina or a penis, there's some natural lubrication, right? That's sort of kind of created. But I've heard that there's definitely some medications that can prevent that as well. Is that true?
Yeah, totally. Like even so if a person like has a vulva and they also have seasonal allergies and they take an antihistamine medication, antihistamine, what does it do for your allergies? It stops mucus production. What is vaginal lubrication? Mucus. So people that might not have needed lube all winter, now spring comes and they're given their antihistamine medication to stop their allergy reaction. Now all of a sudden they're harming themselves accidentally when masturbating because they used to produce enough natural lubrication, but the antihistamine means that they don't. And so now they need lubrication to be provided.
Of course.
Yeah. So
Wild.
that's like an everyday example of like not even something that's like an over the counter. Lots of people are popping antihistamines and not realizing that that's the reason why their vaginal lubrication is changing.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So segue.
Yeah, to sex toys.
So I know this is an area of, obviously, just from your bio and from that list there that you specialize in. My first sort of introduction to sex toys in sort of the disability sector was, again, years ago, before I was kind of into ABA and whatnot, and where somehow this little kind of spiral coiled book, kind of pocket-sized book, ended up on my desk. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, that was put out by some sort of provincial organization and sent out to all like the group homes and the residences and whatnot, that had basically ways for folks, I think it was more towards kind of the physical disability. And so I had supported a lot of, people with like cerebral palsy and things like that. And so for folks with CP and folks who are maybe paraplegic or quadriplegic or any of those things, how can they, engage in either sexual activity with others or by themselves using all of these, and this is the language I was using at the time, seemed like really crazy implements, like things that I just didn't even know existed for any human being.
Yeah, pleasurable. I have it.
That's right. Yeah, that's what it's called. Yeah.
It's from definitely associated with GF Strong, which is in Vancouver. And so they have a spinal cord rehabilitation center there, and it's one of the few that I'm aware of. That's not an area that I work in, so I don't know for sure. But that when people have spinal cord injuries and they go to GF Strong, they have a sexual health rehabilitation team that specializes in helping people figure out what their sex life is going to look like after they've suffered a spinal cord injury, which is like a fabulous resource. And we should have one of those for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as well, in my opinion. Maybe I'll head it up one day.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, carry on.
Maybe we can kind of dive in. I mean, there's sort of one other piece that I thought was really awesome when you and I were kind of having our pre-chat a couple of weeks ago, and it kind of speaks to sort of the idea of going outside of the field to improve your competence. And for the listeners, you go well beyond accessing journals and going to webinars and workshops from other places, where you actually have immersed yourself right into the sector.
I have.
And so maybe tell the listeners a little bit of what you're doing there, why you're doing that, and kind of what your whole interest is in sex toys and lube and that sort of thing.
For sure. Yeah. So when I started merging these two fields, I also applied and currently work at a sex toy store in Victoria. I don't work there a lot. It's just a couple nights a week, but it is fantastic. And I did it, because I was interested and I wanted to, and because it's just really good practice at sexual health education and teaching people. I do, if I work there 2 nights a week for 6 hours, in those 12 hours, I probably do more sexual health education than I might do like in a typical work week, just with people that are coming into the store and they're asking questions and I'm figuring things out with them. And it's just like, it just is like beautiful. Like, I feel like people don't, they think of sort of like these classic sort of like XXX, like seedy sex toy stores, but like the human interactions that I have there are so meaningful, and helping people to find ways to like access pleasure for themselves is just like brings me so much joy. And also just like, learning about like what are the options? How do you help somebody that like has challenges with lubrication? How do you help somebody that has, a physical disability that means that they can't use a sex toy in the traditional way, and just like problem solving that. So, and I've taken that because one thing that I've learned, and again, merging these two fields, is that if you don't know about sex toys and that whole industry, and then I've had a number of consultations where that is a recommendation that I've made for people. And if you don't know what to recommend on the sex toy side, then you're again at risk of doing harm. So something as simple as like, recommending that somebody has access to, say, like a dildo. So somebody with a vagina has been inserting something that's unsafe, and it takes like a 20-second like peruse through Reddit to find streams of people listing things that they have masturbated with in their life, to show you that like people are going to put things in their body. They're going to put things in and on their body, and those things are not going to be safe. So we've got your like electric toothbrushes and your comb handles and your shampoo bottles and carrots, and people are putting these things in their body. And so I've had a number of consultations where people are putting unsafe things in their body. So someone with a vulva or vagina is putting something in their body and it's unsafe. And so somebody says like, okay, we should get them a sex toy so that at least they're putting something safe into their body. But they buy them a sex toy that's not made out of a safe material, and now that person has chronic yeast infections. So if you are just giving them a sex toy that you just like snuck in somewhere and like bought the cheapest thing because, whatever, we'll just give this to the person, but that sex toy is made out of an unsafe material, you're causing now more harm to that person than you were before. So really knowing like, what should you recommend if somebody brings that kind of challenge to me? So I can give you all kinds of recommendations on body safe sex toys that don't have to be expensive. They can be, but they don't have to be. And how can we make that safe for the person? And really a lot of those consultations do center around people that are engaging in harmful masturbation. So if we've ruled out things like medical causes, like medications and all of that stuff, then it is looking at like, maybe this person just isn't successful at masturbating, and maybe they need a tool. There's lots of people that need a tool to help masturbate, particularly people with vulvas that are learning to stimulate their clitoris. Lots and lots and lots of people need help, need a vibrator, need something to help them achieve an orgasm. They can't just do it sort of like quote unquote the old fashioned way with fingers. And even if they could, maybe they still need lubricant. So trying to figure out how we can sort of make masturbation less harmful, which has the side benefit of it feeling better and being more pleasurable. So yeah, there's like a lot there. So another thing is that people think that you have to be 18 to own a sex toy.
Right.
Obviously, it's a podcast. You might have international listeners. I encourage people to look into their local laws and regulations, depending on where you're listening from. But for me here locally, if you go to like a sex toy store, some of them, and you see like you have to be 18 to enter these premises, that has nothing to do with the sex toys that are being sold. And it has everything to do with the fact that those places often also sell pornography, whether that's magazines or DVDs, or some of the boxes and packaging on some sex toys is sexually explicit. So it may have breasts, vulvas, penises pictured on there. But to actually own a sex toy, to physically like have one in your possession, anybody of any age technically could have one.
Really?
And there are like in Vancouver, women's wear, if you go there on Commercial Drive, you'll notice that there is no sign that says 18 plus, because they don't sell pornography and they take everything out of the packages if it happens to have pornographic packaging. I'm pretty sure they make a strong effort not to purchase things that have that packaging. Yeah. And here in Victoria at Island Sexual Health, they have a store attached and they don't sell pornography, and you can go in and you can buy a vibrator, a penis masturbator, a dildo. So there is no age limit. So that's specific to pornography, which I think a lot of people don't know. So they think like, oh, I can't, I'm secretly buying my, daughter a sex toy and she's only, 16. And it's like, that's fine. She can't come into the store to buy it, unfortunately, because we also have packaging that has pornography. But yeah, so that's something for people to be, I think, aware of, that most people think that the age restriction is related to the sex toy, and it's not. So yeah, so finding effective like masturbation aids, teaching people to use lubricant, teaching people to use a masturbator. If somebody has a medication side effect that's making it harder for them to orgasm, sometimes the addition of a sex toy, that additional stimulation, can mean that they can now achieve orgasm. So now they can stay on their medication because maybe there's a completely legitimate reason that they need to be on that medication, and it can't be modified because you found that spot where that person's quality of life is significantly improved. We don't want that person to be depressed, clearly, but we do want that person to not harm themselves when they're masturbating. So if we add lube and a penis masturbator, then you can probably be closer to achieving an orgasm. And I think people think about sex toys often. So like the penis masturbators as like, oh, it just looks like a disembodied vulva, and things like fleshlights and, pardon the language, of pocket pussy. And it's just, people think of them as these like crude things, but there's tons that don't look anything like a body. And so you can get one that just looks, it's just like a piece of like squishy silicone material, and it doesn't look like a vulva at all. And then same with dildos, right? Yes, there are some that look phallic, that look like a penis, but there's plenty that don't look like a penis at all. And so you don't have to buy something that looks like a disembodied body part. There's plenty of options that I would be happy to show, you. Yeah. And so I guess kind of related to that, when you talk about masturbation and how do we teach masturbation and these laws around pornography and stuff, and this comes up quite frequently on like Facebook groups and stuff, is there's a few masturbation instructional videos that people probably have heard about if they haven't seen them, from Dave Hinsberger and his group at Diversity Press is where they're from, based in Toronto, and they do great work. But those videos feature real people masturbating. There's Handmade Love, which is the one for the person with the penis, and then Fingertips, which is the one for the person with the vulva. But they show a real person naked masturbating, and so you can't show that to a person who's under the age of 18 because that's technically pornographic material. So that's the only sort of like instructional video out there in terms of like, what we know is like a video model for people, that we know that that's an effective teaching strategy for people that are autistic, but you can't show that to somebody who's under the age of 18, not as a professional and not as a parent either, right? So facilitating or providing access to pornography is something that is going to be legally not okay. So we need to think of other ways. And so one thing that I, have spent some time on is developing video models that show a penis, and I've bought a dildo, and I've gotten a masturbator and lubricant, and I make a video model showing what to do using this fake penis, so that at least there's like something that we can show people in order to help them learn to masturbate. And for the most part, like most people figure out how to masturbate on their own. They will figure out a way that works for them, and that might look different than the way that somebody else masturbates, but whatever, everybody does it differently. And so very rarely do we have to like physically teach masturbation. And especially if we start to like eliminate some of those other variables, if like masturbation is harmful, then usually people will sort of figure it out without having to be taught. And so also staying away from this idea of like, oh, we're going to have to use hand over hand teaching with somebody, right? Because like that does not send the right message about body boundaries and privacy. But you might have to find somebody that's comfortable doing like a video model or a live model on a dildo, being like, this is what you do, or a model of a vulva. So I have one of those as well. I'm just kind of showing people what it is that you need to do. I have video models of like how to wash a sex toy before and after use, how to wash a vibrator, how to turn a penis masturbator inside out and wash it. People can contact me for consultation if they want access to some of those things. But yeah, so like there's ways to do it, but not everybody has, those teaching materials.
For sure.
Around. And I do. So
I never would have thought of using a sex toy to kind of model some of those skills. That's really, that's ingenious.
Yeah. Like I've got one, it's like it was sold commercially as a penis masturbator, but it looks like a vulva. It's one of those disembodied body part ones. And so I bought that as a teaching model, because then it looks like a real vulva. Because we know that like some of the folks that we support might need those like concrete examples that look like the real thing, right? This like classic sort of urban myth of like, oh, put a condom on a banana, and then somebody puts a condom on a banana and sets it at the bedside table and then ends up with an STI because they're like, well, I put the condom on the banana. I did the thing. It's like some people need those models, right? Like doing it on a drawing or talking about it or showing in a picture isn't good enough. So I just have the teaching materials. It's like, this looks like the real thing, but it's not. So. Yeah.
Amazing. And so do you find that people are open to doing that teaching themselves, or do you find that you're doing it more often?
I mean, I will very rarely do it myself, because I think that like having a random stranger come in and tell you what to do also sends like a different message.
Oh yeah, fair
So
point.
I will usually I do more coaching of other people who are
Right.
in that person's life, who might be a more appropriate person to do that with, whether that's a parent or, somebody who works in like a group home or whatever with them. And occasionally actually going through that with an actual learner who's going to be the person that's learning the skill. Yeah. So there's lots of things to sort of consider, and consents to be put in place, and like all of that sort of stuff. Right. Yeah. And there are we've got the other legal gray area around, and we were kind of talking about this in our pre-chat, of some organizations that do, sex surrogacy, and places like Australia, Israel has a legalized sort of sex surrogate work as well. And, sex work in Canada is in this sort of there's lots of questions about what is legal. There's no there's limited prosecution of sex work in some. It's complicated, but it's a bit of a legal gray area. And there are some people that might do sensual touch and those sorts of things for people with physical disabilities, but maybe they won't do that with a person with a developmental disability, because there's questions around capacity to consent. And so accessing those type of things, or accessing sex work, can be challenging. It can be challenging if we're a person who's facilitating it, right? So we're a third party. I'm pro sex work, pro positive in terms of people accessing and using sex workers. And we just need to sometimes just do teaching around what does that look like to make that safe for a person, if that's something that they're have stated that they want to do. So what are the steps that you can do so that you're safe? And what are the steps that we can do to make sure that the sex worker is safe in that situation?
Wow.
I hear often people being like, oh, well, couldn't they just hire a sex worker? And it's well, sex workers aren't there to just have sex with whomever. That's a job that they're choosing to do. They get to decide who they work with and who they don't, just like I get to decide who I work with and who I don't. So, yeah.
So, and I suppose this is 18 and over.
For sex workers, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and looking at age of consent and all of those things as well, just in terms of, yeah.
Is that a thing that how do people access that sort of sex surrogacy? I mean, sex surrogacy is basically, it sounds like a nice way of saying getting a sex worker into your home.
Yeah. I mean, there's an organization there's organizations in Australia where that's something legal, right? Yeah. So those are agencies that's a service that they provide, and they can advertise, et cetera, that this is what they're doing. Whereas, if people are hiring sex workers in Canada, they might be finding them on online. There's different sort of resources for people to find sex workers online. There's different escort agencies and things like that that might be just doing kind of a companionship thing. And so figuring out what that person wants to do in terms of access and what might be a safer place to point them in order to be able to
and so is that something that you would provide? Obviously you're not doing the direct work, but is that something you would provide consultation on? To sort of say, if you're going to go that route, here's the questions you want to ask?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that I wouldn't consider for myself right now, an area of expertise. And I have very few clients that have ever come to me in that position, but I have had a few. And in those times, I've just worked with local sex workers that I know to try to facilitate, like I said, what would this process look like in terms of how does that person that's choosing to use sex work access that in a way that's safe, and how do we make sure that the sex workers remain safe and they're making a decision that they're comfortable with as well. And sort of both of those. So modeling that's not an area of expertise for me, but when I have had those sort of requests or consultations, I've sort of I've just linked those people with a third party, here's a person that I know that might be able to help you with that. So yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. Just so many different areas that you can kind of go in, and it's so many conversations I don't know that I thought I'd ever have, but I think they're I think it's great that we're able to kind of talk about a lot of this stuff a lot more freely than we were able to maybe 5 or 10 years
Yeah,
ago. I
definitely.
think
Definitely.
that's
For sure.
pretty awesome.
Hmm.
We are. I didn't really set a time per se. I feel like we could just talk about this for hours on end because,
Indeed.
like I said, there's just so many different realms. But most of these have been going about an hour and a half, so maybe we can look at kind of
Yeah.
wrapping it up a bit. I'm just wondering if there's sort of anything else that would be good to sort of share with listeners, particularly kind of BCBAs who are kind of looking to kind of do more here, because I think
Hmm.
I often see online in these groups, and I know even just talking about sort of therapy recommendations in general on Facebook is sketchy, and there's
Yeah.
a lot of ethics around that. I think it's great when a moderator comes in and says, "Hey, you shouldn't be asking these kinds of questions." But it gets really scary when the questions are sexual, and people just start making sort of random kind of suggestions. And so, what are maybe some good sort of initial steps for behavior analysts to kind of maybe don't want to go the whole route of getting certified, although I think that's a great idea, to kind of expand themselves a bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, the searching for consultation on Facebook is sort of one of those things that, I mean, not having access to behavior, or like not having access to information, shapes all kinds of behavior, right? So, where you're getting the reinforcement that you're looking for in terms of like a brief answer to your question, but is it really the best answer, and ethically
Hmm.
should be doing some of those things? So I do think that looking at something like reaching out to join the sexual behavior research and practice SIG, I mean, even if you're not formally joining us, although we, encourage people to, run for positions on the board, get involved, come to our meetings with virtual ABAI, and in the spring
Hmm.
we'll be hosting a number of events there, and just contacting some of that information. That's a good place. I know it's hard when we only have so much money as professionals to spend on CEUs,
Yeah.
or just personally or professionally, whether that's supported at a place we might work or not. We're doing it on our own, and there's so many things. And again, this is sort of why specializing in sexual health education, because I was just like exhausted from trying to be a jack of all trades,
Hmm.
and supporting autism intervention. And so there's so many things that you want to like get good at. But even if you just try to expand your scope by one CEU that you do, make it something related to sexual health or relationship education in terms of CEUs, whether that's something that you do at BCABA. I mean, I've presented there every year for the last 3 years or so, something related to this field. So for local BC listeners, and I plan to submit a presentation about sex toys for the next BC ABBA. So if you're a local BC
Awesome.
listener, you could just sign up for that for September. But so I think that's a good first step. And honestly, like just getting generally comfortable with the topic of sexuality, even if it's not related to disability at all. Like obviously this podcast, you've made it this far, you're listening, but look at other sexual health like podcasts and just put it on in the car, and just hearing people talking about a topic that you didn't think that you would encounter ever might just like make you feel more comfortable with bringing that up with a family, right? That at first conversation of like, I think it might be important to like add penis to the vocabulary for their receptive identification of body parts. Could you work on that at home during bath time? Is like a super awkward conversation if you've never said penis in a professional context before.
Hmm.
So just like, practicing getting comfortable with the topic broadly can be like a huge first step for some people. So if you just look up sex and podcasts, there's plenty out there. And I think any of those would do well. On the sexual behavior research and practice SIG, we have a podcast listing resource there, and we've posted it on our
Oh,
Facebook
perfect.
as well. So some different ones that people like. If there's like following different like sex positive like Instagram accounts, I'll do like a little shout out to one. It's
Hmm.
called Sex Positive Families,
Cool.
and it's just really brief. Her name is Melissa Carnegie Pinter, or Pinter Carnegie. I apologize to them. But they just put up like really good short things about, how to work on consent, how to like talk about body parts, tips for talking about things like pornography and all of that sort of stuff. So just like having that come up on your Instagram feed, like the word, vulva or pictures of, stylized pictures of vulva, just like brings a level of comfort. And so little things like that doesn't mean you're going to have a scope of practice or a scope of competence in the area, but it gets you more comfortable. So I think that's like an actionable item for a lot of folks, like signing up for a CEU or something like that might not be achievable for people right now, but downloading a podcast and listening to it the next time you're stuck in Vancouver traffic is doable.
We this is a CEU podcast, and so we're gonna have secret words through the podcast, and so definitely penis and vulva will be in there. What should the third one be?
What should the third one be? I'm going to give a shout out to the clitoris. If you could, clitoris doesn't get nearly enough attention. So if you could add clitoris, that would be great.
That's awesome. So I want everybody who's listening right now to say penis, vulva, and clitoris out loud. The third secret word is clitoris. So you get your CEU.
Yes.
That would be awesome. Well, that's super cool. So you've shared so many great resources, and I just want to let folks know that I'm going to have detailed show notes that'll have links and names and all this stuff. I've taken copious notes as you've been speaking, and I'll make sure all that stuff is going to be out there. And Landa, this was just so awesome. I think we're so lucky to have you locally, but also I think whether you've noticed it or not, you've become a big name yourself in this field and in this area, and I think that's just so awesome. And so awesome that this was a dream of yours from childhood, that you're able to sort of bring back and link up with ABA. I think it's so fantastic when folks have passions in other areas and are able to connect it to ABA and really make those really kind of cool specializations. So thanks again for being on the show. So awesome. We'll definitely bring it back and talk about 35 other things another time.
Part 2, part 35.
That's right. Yeah, sure. Exactly. And we need more secret words, right? That people can say. So
yes, I've got so many.
So that'll be awesome. So cool. Thanks a lot for being here.
Thank you.